Triton never looked big from orbit. From the carrier's window, it was just a dirty pearl, a ball of ice scratched by old impacts, skimming around Neptune like it was trying not to be noticed. Up close, when the drill lift shuddered down through the shaft we had burned into its crust, it felt heavier. The ice above us pressed down in meters, then tens of meters, then more than I cared to count. "Depth check," Rig called through the intercom. His voice came thin through the helmet speakers. "Stroud, you seeing any shift in stress readings?" I checked the wrist pad clipped to my suit. No digits, just colored bars and a simple line showing the weight of the ice on the shaft collar. Everything stayed in the green. "We're fine," I answered. "If this thing caves, it won't be because of the ice." Wolf snorted beside me. He braced one gloved hand on the safety rail as the lift clanked past another support ring. "Comforting as always, Doc." The fourth man, Oswald Spinks, leaned close to the guard mesh and squinted down at the darkness below. Spinks was one of those archaeologists who ended up in space because there were more ruins out here than back home. "You can almost see the glow from the chamber." "It's not a glow," I muttered. "It is our lamp grid. You want alien magic, talk to marketing." The intercom crackled once, then Rig's tone flattened. "Focus. We get in, sample the organ complex, and get out. Surface window is short." I pictured him up in the surface shack, harnessed to the control chair, eyes on a dozen readouts. He preferred being out here with us, but command meant knowing when to stay back. He learned that lesson with me on Mars. I pushed that thought away and watched the shaft instead. The ice around us changed as we descended. Opaque blue to grey streaked with darker veins, then to grainy layers that looked like stacked waves. As we moved, the lamp grid below swelled from a pinprick to a hazy pool of white. Then the lift reached the bottom stop with a dull jolt. The safety bar swung open. Cold slid into my joints even through the suit insulation. Triton's air outside the station is so thin it may as well not exist, but in the shaft there were always stray drafts, ice shifting around old vents. Wolf hopped off first, boots crunching on the grated platform. He was our systems tech, lean and jittery, hair shaved down to keep it from catching on seals. He clipped a tether to the rail, then to his harness. "Last one down buys first round back in the mess." "You stocked the mess," Spinks answered. "That is a hollow threat." I stepped onto the platform and made myself look past them, into the tunnel we had melted through the last layer of ice. The cavern lay beyond that tunnel. Sensors picked up something dense beneath the crust weeks ago. Rig rerouted half our power into the drills and heat lances, and the ice finally gave way. What we found was not rock. "Helmet seals check," I said. "No scratches, no fogging, no excuses." They ran hands over their collars, along neck rings and clips. I checked mine by feel, knuckles bumping the metal. Habit from Mars. There, a cheap seal sprayed a fungus into a whole wing of a hospital. Here, an invisible microbe could ride Triton dust and sink into the only living tissue around. We filed into the tunnel. The walls glistened with fresh melt, glassy and uneven where the heat lance had carved. After a short bend, the passage opened into the chamber, and the breath I was not supposed to think about caught for half a second anyway. The chamber roof rose in an arc that reminded me of a blown soap bubble frozen mid-burst. The inner surface was reinforced with something halfway between bone and coral. Pale rods curved out from the ice and fused together, thick enough to serve as ribs bracing the cavern. Between them ran cables of darker material, bundled and joined, like old tendons petrified in mid-strain. Spinks paused under one of the supports and laid a gloved palm against it. "You see the striations? Growth bands. This whole vault is grown, not built. Wonderful." "Do not touch anything you do not have to," I snapped. "Organic means active until proven otherwise. Treat every surface as hot." He lifted his hand, palm already dusted with frozen crystals that fell in a slow spill as he moved. "Then let us collect our hot prize and get back upstairs." At the center of the chamber, the thing we had come for rose out of the floor like a low altar. The slab was the size of a ground transport, waist high, sides bulging out as if whatever grew it had swollen too far before stiffening. Its surface was made of layered tissue, some dried dark and flaking, some still faintly translucent. Under the portable lamps, threads of color ran through it, dull blues and muddy greens like old veins. I stepped closer. My suit's internal heaters ticked a little higher against the cold. A thin glaze of frost retreated where my chest plate faced the slab. "Is this all one organism?" Riggs' voice crackled in our ears. "Sphinx?" Sphinx circled to the far side, helmet light jittering over the curves. "From the image scans, it was once part of a network. This is just the node that survived the ice." "Organ complex," I murmured. "Nexus of some kind." "See these branching pits?" I pointed with a gloved finger. The surface bulged in rounded mounds, each with a small depression at the top, ringed with fibrous tissue like petrified muscle. "Attachment sites. Connections went up into the ceiling and along the walls. The rest was torn away or decayed." "Which means," Rigg answered, "that slab is our sample. Stroud, give me a time frame for extraction. Short as possible if you want it intact." I unclipped a marker and traced a rough rectangle on the surface, big enough for a transport pod. The marker left a dark line on the pale tissue. "We used the micro saw, not the lance. Those bands might be structure or writing." "Writing?" Wolf leaned closer, letting his helmet lamp rake across the slab. "Looks like roast to me." "Everything looks like food to you," Sphinx muttered. "Enough." Riggs' tone sharpened. "Stroud, bring it up within the hour. You have full authority on containment. Do not make me remind you what is riding on this mission." He did not need to. After Mars, the consortium gave me one more job, and Rigg had been the one to sign off. I kept that in mind as I signaled Wolf for the saw. We worked quickly. The teeth of the cutter whined through layers of tissue and tough fibrous cords. The slab did not bleed. A thin vapor rose where friction warmed it. The lamps caught motes swirling in the air. "Watch the particles," I warned. "Minimize disturbance. Sphinx, stand clear of the cut." He backed away, annoyed but compliant. Wolf steadied the slab with both hands, braced against the floor. The cut section came free with a tearing pop. For a moment, the slab heaved under my hands, a slow upward push against my palms. It might have been my own tremor transferring through the tool. It might not. We eased the section into the waiting pod. The pod was a polyglass cylinder anchored in a metal frame, its interior lined with gel. I triggered the seals. A faint line of frost chased around the rim as the pod dropped to isolation pressure. "Containment secure," I said, returning to the lift. "Good work." Riggs' tone loosened by a fraction. "Do not dawdle down there." We hoisted the pod. For a moment I caught a trick of light on the tissue inside. A subtle crawl just under the surface, as if something deep within shifted away from the cold, toward my gloved hands. I told myself it was nerves and the strain of the cut. Then I led the way out. On the climb, I tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. On Mars, I had seen clinics overrun by something we thought was just another fungal infection. There, my mistake had been staying inside the safety lines. I had followed protocol and kept the wings sealed while we waited for official clearance. Patients had pounded on the glass. By the time clearance came, they did not move at all. Up here, I told myself, I would not freeze in place. The lift shuddered up the shaft. Above, the tiny circle of surface light grew until it filled my helmet visor. Rigg waited at the top, suit on, helmet under one arm, his silver-streaked hair puffed by the dry cold. "How does it feel to touch history?" he asked. The pod hung in the rig between me and Wolf. "Wet," I answered. "Let us get it into the box before it decides to tell us how it feels about us." Rigg looked at the slab through the polyglass cylinder. For a moment, his face softened, the way it did when he talked about old sea wrecks on Earth. Then command settled back over his features like a helmet. "Lab wing is ready," he said. "Straight there, No detours. We moved as one through the connecting tunnel, past the life support module and the mess hall where the rest of the crew pretended not to stare. Triton's survey facility was never meant for comfort. It was a cluster of metal and composite modules bolted into the ice, each with its own air seal. The walls sweated frost in the corners despite insulation. Every corridor bent or narrowed for reasons that made sense in some budget office far away. The bio wing sat at the far end for obvious reasons. I keyed my wrist pad against the outer door. It cycled open with a sluggish grind. We rolled the pod inside and anchored it in the center of the room. "Wolf, secure the clamps," I said out of habit, then caught myself. "Secure the brackets." He locked the pod frame onto the floor mounts, then checked the pressure gauges. Internal seal confirmed. Environment stable. No leaks. Spinks hovered by the observation window into the hot room, practically vibrating. "How much can we see without opening it?" "Enough." I moved to the console and brought up the pod's internal cameras. The slab section filled the main view, its surface ridged and pale. I zoomed in on one of the darker lines. Up close, it resolved into overlapping ridges of tissue, each ridge maybe the width of a fingernail, running in parallel tracks. At intervals, they crossed and joined, forming angular glyphs. "Script," Spinks breathed. "I told you." "Let us pretend it is a hazard until I say otherwise," I answered. "We move it to the hot room and bring the temp up a few degrees. Then we watch how it reacts." Rig clipped his helmet to a wall bracket and stepped in behind us. "You have until the next orbital window to make this worth the fuel. Then I send up a preliminary report. Understood?" I heard the unspoken part. "I did not bring you here to freeze and dissect one lump of alien meat. I brought you here to show the board that giving you a second chance was not a mistake." "Understood," I replied. We initiated the transfer. The pod frame slid along a rail into the hot room. The inner door locked. Heating coils in the floor woke with a crackle. The internal sensors ticked upward by a handful of degrees. For a minute, nothing changed. Then the slab section convulsed. Not much. Not a dramatic jump. The whole mass twitched once, a slow ripple that started at one corner and ran along the length like a wave under a blanket. The ridges brightened, faint color rising in them as if someone had run dye along the grooves. "Temperature spike is minimal," I murmured. "That movement is not thermal expansion." "Is it alive?" Wolf whispered. I did not answer. The word alive carries weight that does not belong here yet. It was active. That was enough. "Document everything," Rig ordered. "Stroud, do not open that room until you have mapped every response to temperature and atmosphere you can manage." He left after that, pulled back to the swarm of other duties that came with command. We stayed. Spinks narrated observations into his recorder. Wolf watched the gauges and made anxious jokes. I logged every twitch and brightening ridge. Hours passed. The slab responded to new stimuli. Slight changes in oxygen content inside the pod. Shifts in ambient pressure. Minor variations in electromagnetic noise. Each time a different section brightened. Ridges rising a bit more. Script lines thickening. "It is like it is trying to connect," Spinks said at one point. Quiet. More to himself than to us. Like a living mural adjusting to our environment. "It is also inside a sealed container," I answered, more sharply than needed. "Let us keep it that way." The container did not fail because of the slab. It failed because one clamp was old, and Wolf moved too fast. We had to shift the pod slightly to let one of the floor sensors register contact. Wolf released the front clamp and pivoted the frame. One of the rear clamps stuck. He cursed, yanked harder, and the pod lurched in its bracket. The cylinder rocked. For a second, I saw the internal readouts flash red as the pod slammed against its mount. Then the lid jolted, and a thin line opened along the seal. I saw it in the monitor, a bright crescent of ambient light sliding across the top of the tissue. At the same time, a tiny white plume puffed out into the hot room's air, like someone exhaling in winter. "Clamp it," I barked. Wolf grabbed the frame, trying to steady it. His gloved forearm grazed the cylinder. The sheen of frost there cracked, and beneath, the slab bulged up. Something soft and pale slapped against the inner wall, pressed, and a smear of translucent gel traced across the polyglass directly opposite his arm. He jerked back, instinctive. His elbow clipped the emergency latch on his own outer glove. The seal popped. The glove twisted, and before he could clamp it shut again, a ribbon of that pale gel oozed through a hairline crack in the cylinder and brushed the exposed band of skin at his wrist. He hissed, more from shock than pain. "Shit! Shit! I am hit!" I was on him before he finished the last word. "Hold it still." The gel sank into his skin as if his arm were thirsty. It left no residue on the surface. For one awful second, his veins stood out darker, then faded. "Get that glove sealed," I ordered. "Wolf, look at me. Any numbness, tingling, pain?" "Cold," he muttered. "Just cold." "That is because you are standing in this room in a standard work suit." I grabbed his elbow, marched him to the exit. "Out, decon. Lock this room down." We cycled out through the autoclave. Jets of antiseptic washed our suits. The inner door shut behind us with a thud that felt final. I stripped his gear in the anteroom, hands quick but careful. The exposed wrist already looked different. The skin there puffed slightly, as if a welt formed under the surface. Tiny straight lines radiated out from the contact point. "Wolf." I caught his gaze. His pupils were normal, his breathing still fast but not panicked. "We are doing this by the book. You are isolated until I say otherwise." "You think it is in me?" His voice wavered. "I think something foreign touched your bloodstream." I reached for a handheld scanner. "You know the rules." "Yeah." We moved him to the quarantine bunk, a narrow compartment with its own air system just off the lab. I keyed in lockdown. The door sealed with a heavy slide. Inside, he sat on the cot and stared at his arm. The swelling had advanced. The lines that radiated out from the original contact point had grown more pronounced, raised slightly above the surrounding skin. They were straight. Too straight to be random welts. They stood in parallel sets with occasional crossbars and angles between them. "Get me imaging," I murmured to the medic on duty, Vernon Molesworth, who had hurried in at my page. Molesworth's eyes flicked from the wrist to my face and back again. He nodded once and moved to the control panel. Over the next hour, I watched flesh become ink. The lines marched up Wolf's arm in ordered tracks. He scratched once, flinched when I barked at him through the intercom, then clenched his hand into a fist and kept it on his lap. The ridges thickened. New ones sprouted between them, cross-connecting. Spinks pressed close to the observation window. "It is following a schema," he muttered. "Look here. These blocks repeat. There are margins. Column structure. This is not an infection. It is carving." "It is both," I answered. "And you stay on that side of the glass." After 2 hours, the ridges had reached Wolf's elbow. His skin looked stamped, the way old printing plates impressed letters into paper. Only this paper flexed and trembled, and tried not to whimper. He met my gaze through the glass. "Doc," he said, lips dry. "Honest, how bad?" "We do not know yet." "You just used the royal we," he noted. "Always a bad sign." I allowed myself the smallest curve of a mouth. "You are going to be the favorite case study in every conference I ever give." "Do I get royalties?" "You do not make this easy, do you?" "Never saw the point." He breathed out and leaned his head back against the wall. For a while, none of us spoke. By the end of the shift, the lines had crossed his shoulder. They did not spread the way a rash does. There were no random blotches, no irregular edges. The new ridges sprang up in exact rows, aligning with the ones before. Where they passed tattoos or scars, they flowed around them, like a river finding a path between rocks. I went into the lab alone and prepared a biopsy kit. Molesworth watched through the window as I cycled into the quarantine room in full biosuit. Wolf gave a thin laugh. "If you are going to poke me, buy me a drink first," he said. "When we get back to orbit, I answered. I did not let myself think about whether that would ever happen. Roll your arm. He did. The skin felt warm under the suit's gloved fingers. The ridges were firm, like cords laid under the surface. I took a sample from the edge of the spread where normal skin met altered. The tissue clung to the cutter blade. A bead of blood welled, dark against the pale lines. When I sealed the sample into its vial and lifted it to the suit visor, I swore I saw the cut edge move, like tiny mouths opening and closing in cross-section. Back in the main lab, I mounted the slice on a slide and brought it under the microscope. A camera could not capture the exact impression of what I saw, but it could record the shapes. It showed a field of cells, round and familiar, pressed into new arrangements by something threaded between them. The foreign elements looked like filaments, much darker than the host cells, braided into narrow strands. They wrapped around individual cells, pinched their membranes, and pushed them into elongated shapes. Where two strands crossed, the host tissue formed a thicker mass. Under higher magnification, the filaments themselves seemed to twitch very slightly, as if adjusting their grip. The script is not ink, I murmured. It is scaffolding. It is building the ridges from his own tissue. Spinks leaned in over my shoulder. It is using him as a printing press. That is one way to put it. It is beautiful, he whispered. I did not answer that. We set up an array of cameras around Wolf's bunk and started a time-lapse. Every few minutes I checked his vitals. His heart rate climbed, his temperature followed. He began to shiver, sweat beading his hairline and soaking the thin shirt. In the main lab, the slab inside the pod continued its pulsations, responding to the changing conditions in the room. I ignored it as much as possible and focused on the man. By the time Rig arrived in person, drawn by the flood of status alerts, the ridges had reached Wolf's neck. He stood behind me at the observation window, arms folded tight. His gaze tracked every new line as it rose. How many hours since exposure? He asked. I gave him a rough count. No digits. Just under half a day. Spread rate. Non-linear. It accelerates when it crosses certain regions. Follows larger vessels and thicker muscle groups. It slows when it meets bone. Can you stop it? I did not answer immediately. The honest answer was no. We knew nothing about the underlying mechanism. An aggressive immune booster could trigger a storm that killed him faster. A suppressant might let the foreign tissue proliferate unchecked. We do not have enough data, I settled on. But we can still learn from him. And then? Then we act according to what we know. He turned his head just enough for me to see his eyes. Last time you waited for data, Crispin, people died. You remember that? That was a different situation, I snapped. We had a known pathogen and a clear treatment window. I followed protocol. You watched them die behind glass. I watched them die because the board was too slow to authorize the drugs. I hissed. My throat tightened. You know that. I know they blamed you and closed the file, he answered. I also know I pulled you out of that grave and brought you here because you do not flinch around biohazard. So I am asking you again, not the board. Can you stop it? The ridges had reached Wolf's jawline now. They traced along his cheek, over his lips, forming bands and hooks. His eyes tracked us through the haze. I do not know, I whispered. Rig exhaled through his nose. Then we plan for worst case. He turned to Molesworth. Initiate lockdown on the entire bio-wing. No one in or out without my authorization. Seal the vents. Route waste to the external burn chute. Molesworth tapped the controls with quick, efficient motions. The doors around us thumped into place. A red light above the main entrance turned steady. What about the sample in the pod? Rig asked. The organ complex? I shook my head. It stays where it is. Whatever came out of it already hit Wolf. We gain nothing by destroying it yet. You are sure it cannot break containment again? We reinforce the clamps. We isolate the pod. We deactivate any remote triggers that might open it. and we do not put any more bare skin near it. Ever." He studied me a moment longer, then gave a short nod. "You have one chance to make this worth the risk. Get me something I can send to the board that is more than a casualty report." He left after that, pulled away to manage the rest of the station. He still had fuel budgets, power allocation, and a crew of men who did not yet know one of their own was turning into a carved tablet 2 modules over. I stayed. As Triton spun through Neptune's shadow, night cycle on the station was more theory than practice. Lights dimmed, temperature dropped a notch. The station groaned as the ice shifted around it. In the bio wing, none of that mattered. Around the middle of the dark period, Wolf stopped answering when I spoke to him. His eyes stayed open, but they did not track my movements in the usual way. They fixed on a spot above the door, then on the ceiling corner, then back to the door again, like he was following something invisible. The ridges had crossed both cheeks now, forming dense bands around his mouth and nose. He breathed in short, shallow bursts. Each exhale fogged the glass for a second. Then, slowly, his arms lifted. At first I thought it was a seizure. His hands jerked, fingers splaying. His shoulders rolled. Then the motion settled into something disturbingly controlled. His right arm rose to the side, joints locking at each step, shoulder level, elbow straight. The ridges along his biceps thickened, deepened, as if supporting the pose. His left arm followed, same motion, same stiff extension. His legs shifted. He pushed his feet against the floor and straightened his knees. His back arched. Within a minute, he stood in the center of the room, arms stretched out, body rigid like a man nailed into place by invisible stakes. I stared at him through the glass. "Wolf," I murmured. "Do you hear me?" No response. His mouth did not move. His chest rose and fell, slower now, under a curtain of dense script. The ridges kept working. They filled in the spaces across his chest, his abdomen, his thighs. Column after column, character after character, like printer lines filling a page. Spinks whispered a curse under his breath. "It is finishing the monument." "Back up," I told him. My voice sounded distant in my own ears. "This is not just building. It is posturing him for display." "Display to whom? We are the only ones here." "Does it matter?" I ran a hand over my face shield. "Molesworth, prep the purge." He flinched. "Doctor, we do not know if those movements are voluntary. If it tries to use him for more than writing, we cannot let that reach beyond this room." I opened a channel to Rig. "Commander, we are at decision point." His voice came back immediately. "Report. Wolf's body is almost entirely altered. The ridges have turned him into a complete glyph field. He is also frozen in position, arms out. There is no voluntary response. I recommend partial purge. Target the quarantine bunk. We preserve a portion of his remains for study and eliminate active tissue." There was a pause. I could picture him in the control chair, fingers hovering over the purge controls. "How much of him do you need?" he asked. I closed my eyes for a second, then opened them again. "Torso and head. If we freeze from mid-thigh down, we should contain most generative tissue while keeping the majority of the script intact." Another pause. "Understood. You are certain this will not breach containment?" "There is no certainty here," I replied. "Only less danger." "Then we do it. On your mark." I looked at Wolf through the glass one last time. For a ridiculous, stubborn second, I hoped he would blink, move his fingers, proof that there was still someone in there to ask. He stared past me, eyes fixed on some distant point, ridges crawling over his eyelids. "Mark," I whispered. Molesworth punched the command. In the quarantine bunk, nozzles in the ceiling snapped open. A roaring fog of frozen gas crashed down over Wolf, a white storm in a confined space. It hit his skin and spread along his body, crawling up from the floor. The glass fogged completely. Alarms chimed as temperature sensors plunged. I watched the readouts, heart counting off the seconds against my will. When the purge stopped, the fog thinned. Wolf stood exactly as before, arms out, back arched, entire lower body fused into a seamless column of ice. From waist down, he was a frozen pedestal. From waist up, he remained flesh turned to script, though frost clung to every ridge. We had killed the man. What remained was the monument. I wrote that in my log because if I softened the language there, I would start softening it everywhere. We waited for the ice to settle, then began preparations to cut out the preserved upper half of the body for later study. By the time we finished, Triton's orbit had carried us half a world away, and the rest of the station still slept uneasily, unaware that one of their own had become an engraved statue in the lab wing. I went to my bunk, lay on the narrow mattress, and stared at the metal ceiling. "You did this," a quiet voice in my head said. "You pushed to keep him alive long enough to read him." The other voice, just as quiet, countered. "You kept him alive long enough to give those hours meaning. If you had purged at the first lines, you would have learned nothing." Mars sat between those two voices, still and heavy. There, my inaction had been labelled a crime. Here, my action would probably earn the same. I closed my eyes and waited for the sleep aid to drag me under. It did not. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and filled with images of skin turning to script. The next station day, the rest of the crew learned the basics. We did not give them the details. Rigg stood in the mess hall, informed them that Wolf had suffered exposure to active alien tissue, that he was dead, and that Bio-Wing was locked until further notice. Questions followed. How did it happen? Could it spread? Were they at risk? Rigg fielded most of them. I watched from the back and answered none. The less they looked at me as the man who had cut the alien slab, the better. After the briefing, we went back to work. We had a frozen half-statue in a chamber and a living organ complex in a pod. If we did not learn from them, then Wolf had died for nothing. Spinks and I suited up for the autopsy. The preserved portion of Wolf's body lay inside a secondary containment cell, propped upright. The script stood out in dark relief against his pale flesh, running in dense bands from clavicle to forehead. We brought in equipment, saws for bone, scalpels for tissue, sample jars labelled in my neat block script. Molesworth checked our seals twice and locked the inner door. "I will monitor air and pressure levels," he said through the intercom. "Any sign of breach, I trip the emergency shutter." "Do that and you will trap us in here with him," Spinks muttered. "Better than trapping the whole station with you," I answered. We started with the chest. The bone was brittle from the purge, crackling under the saw. I cut a rectangular panel from the sternum and eased it open like a door. Frost flaked from the severed edges. Inside, the ridges did not stop at the skin. They wrapped ribs and muscle, coiled around the heart and lungs. The heart was smaller than I remembered from anatomy labs, not because human hearts changed, but because this one looked constricted, its outer surface bound in narrow bands of alien tissue. The bands crisscrossed, thickening at certain intersections into nodes the size of thumbnails. Spinks leaned closer, visor almost touching the opening. "Those nodes repeat. Same placement on each side, almost like punctuation marks." "Record and label," I answered. "Right atrial band, node 1, left atrial band, node 2. We catalogued what we could. At the throat, the ridges on the inside tightened around the larynx. Small loops joined there, forming shapes that repeated on the skin of his neck. His tongue showed the same, tiny raised arcs along the edges like the start of a paragraph. "It is not random placement," Spinks murmured. "It uses his anatomy as layout. Heart for one category, throat for another. Maybe memory, maybe sound." "You are guessing," I replied. I kept my focus on the cut lines, hard metal in my hands, solid points in all this. That will make a good paper later. Right now we look for operational information. Such as? Transmission method, vector spread, host compatibility. Anything that tells us how this thing moves. It did not take long to find out It moved better than we thought. We were halfway through removing a section of his right lung when one of the nodes along the bronchial passage cracked. I heard it through the suit audio. A small, sharp sound, like ice fracturing. Then a gush of darker material oozed out, half liquid, half clumpy, into the open cavity. It hit the cold air, stiffened and broke apart. Fine dust scattered. "Containment," I snapped. Molesworth reacted instantly. The emergency shutters slid down around the cell, sealing us inside. Vent systems cut off, replaced by sealed internal circulation. The dust settled on the instrument tray, on my gloves, on Spinks's visor. "I am reading foreign particulates in the local air," Molesworth reported. "Filters in your suits are holding. Mostly." "Mostly?" Spinks's voice jumped. "Define mostly." "There is trace penetration in your external layer." Molesworth's tone stayed calm, but that did not help much. "Inner seals still read intact. Do not scratch, do not touch your own skin." I resisted the urge to swipe at my face. The suit hood felt tighter. "Note it in the log," I said. "Contagion can aerosolize from internal nodes when damaged. That means any host could become a local generator, not just the primary slab." "That means," Spinks put in, "if this ever spreads outside a controlled environment, any infected body becomes a walking release system." "Thank you for that image," I muttered. We finished the autopsy with slower, more careful motions. Where we encountered more nodes, we left them intact. We marked their positions, recorded their density. Then we sealed the samples in triple containers and cycled out. The decontamination showers afterward were thorough enough to strip paint. Chemical baths pounded our suits, then our skin. When I finally stepped into the main locker room, my hair clung damply to my skull, and my skin felt like paper. "You could have stopped," Rig told me when I reported to him. "Once you realized it had aerosol potential, you could have halted the procedure." "And then we would not know that," I answered. "We would still be assuming it needed direct contact." "You are gambling with people's lives," he snapped. "Again." "I am minimizing unknowns," I shot back. Then I lowered my voice. "We got out clean. The shutters held. The suits held. We are not Mars." He stared at me, eyes narrow. "For your sake, I hope that stays true." It did not for long. The second infection did not happen in the lab. It happened in a maintenance corridor on the far side of the station. I was in the mess hall, picking at food I did not taste, when the station alert tone sounded. Not the full emergency howl. The sharp triple chime that meant localized medical event. "Report!" Rig barked over the general channel. "Engineer Hobb down in Corridor C," came Molesworth's voice. "Possible stroke or seizure. Requesting assistance." I was already half out of my chair. "On my way." The corridor lights were dimmed for night cycle. Shadows pushed into the corners. A toolbox lay open on the floor, spilled wrenches and patch kits glinting. Hobb lay on his side beside it, one hand curled under his chest, his other hand clawed at his neck. Molesworth knelt beside him, checking his pulse. "He was doing a joint check on the vent seals," the medic reported. "Collapsed mid-report." "Any contact with the lab?" I asked. "None. He has not been near the bio wing since the lockdown." I rolled Hobb gently onto his back. At first glance, it looked like a rash. Raised lines under the skin of his neck, faint but visible, running in narrow rows from the base of his skull toward his collarbone. At second glance, it looked like exactly what I feared. "No," I whispered. "What?" Rig had jogged up behind us, breath rough, uniform half-zipped. He looked down, took in the lines, and his face hardened. "How?" "I do not know," I answered. He was nowhere near the pod, nowhere near Wolf. The only airborne release we documented was during the autopsy, and that was contained. "Unless it was not," Rig said. I forced myself to breathe slowly. "We still have independent air systems in each module. We have filters. We have shutters. There are other vectors, fomites, shared tools, clothing." "What do we do?" "We isolate him," I replied. "Same as Wolf." Only this time we do it outside the lab. Rig flinched. We are not building another monument on my station. If we move him through the main corridors now, we risk contamination everywhere. I looked around. The maintenance corridor was narrow, a dead end, with a storage room at the far end. There. We convert that into a sealed cell. We patch the vents, set up standalone circulation. We move him once, carefully, and then no one else goes in without full gear. Rig stared at Hob. Then he lifted his wrist and keyed the general channel. His voice dropped into that clipped tone that meant no argument. All personnel, listen up. Corridor C and adjacent spaces are now red zones. No one enters without level 3 protection. Vernon, assist Stroud in building a makeshift isolation in the C storage room. Everyone else, stay clear and report to your nearest supervisor for status checks. He cut the channel and turned back to me. You get one more subject, he said quietly. One. We cannot afford more. After that, any sign of ridges on anyone, we purge immediately. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him that 2 cases were barely enough to form a baseline, that science does not care about our comfort. Instead, I looked at Hob, at the lines on his neck, and swallowed the words. 1, I agreed. We moved Hob carefully. He groaned once, a low sound in his throat when we lifted him. The ridges along his neck and scalp had advanced in the short time we spent talking. They rose like fresh scars under the skin. The storage room we claimed as his new cell was small and cluttered, but it had a door that sealed and a vent we could close. We stripped it to bare walls, hauled in a cot, bolted a portable toilet to the floor, and mounted cameras in the corners. By the time we had finished, the ridges had reached his jaw. I stared at that line of script. The same symbols, in the same arrangement, had appeared on Wolf's neck. Different man. Same carving. The contagion was not improvising, it was rendering. Spinks arrived under escort just as we finished the last checks. He took in the scene, the cords at his neck jumping. You are doing this again, he said. Another host. Another data point, I answered. And another life, Rig put in. Do not forget that part, Spinks. I am not the one who authorized this, Spinks shot back. No, Rig replied, but you will be the one to make whatever you learn count. He stepped closer to me, lowering his voice. The orbital carrier checked in. They want an update. I did not mention the second infection. If this spreads to a third, I will have to. And you know what their protocol is. Station sterilization, I murmured. They would order you to trigger self-destruct. They would order me to pull the carrier back to a safe distance and cut this place loose, he corrected. And then whoever is still down here burns. He met my gaze. I will not let that happen if I can avoid it. You owe me honest odds, Crispin. Do we stand a chance at containing this? I thought of the aerosol in the autopsy chamber. I thought of Wolf's arms frozen in that display pose, the script across his chest. I thought of Hob's neck. No, I said. Not in the way you mean. It moves too easily. We do not know all its paths. Then what are we doing? We are learning enough to influence what happens next, I answered. If this thing is just a weapon, we torch the lab and die. If it is a warning, and we can read it, maybe some part of this mess serves a purpose beyond killing us. That is a gambler's answer. So is saying yes to a mission like this, I muttered. You knew the odds when you signed on. He stared at me for a long beat. Fine, you get your warning, but not at the cost of the rest of the system. He walked away before I could reply. In the isolation cell, Hob's skin kept changing. The script marched down his torso. The ridges thickened over his ribs, across his belly, down his thighs. We recorded every centimeter, switched camera angles, tried different imaging angles to see if depth gave more context. This time the script looked different. Not just the same lines in the same places. There were new blocks, new arrangements. The bands on his abdomen looked like stacked stylistic scenes, rows of tall figures with bowed backs, their arms bound to their sides by bands of darker ink. Above them, shapes that might be towers, leaning. Above those, jagged arcs that reminded me of fractures in ice viewed from below. Spinks zoomed in, eyes gritty from lack of sleep. "This is narrative," he murmured. "Sequential image sets. Here these icons repeat from Wolf's chest but extended. I think we are seeing their last days." "Describe it in plain words," I said. "If you can." He tapped one of the screen corners. "These figures here, along the lower band, they are all oriented the same direction, facing a central point we cannot see. The markings along their limbs match the writing around Wolf's heart. If that symbol set refers to the contagion itself, then they might be showing volunteers or victims being given the tissue." "You are guessing," I reminded him. "Yes." He did not apologize. "But look at the upper band. Here. These shapes falling from above, striking the towers. The glyphs around those shapes resemble the ones around the nodes we found in Wolf's lungs. Maybe they refer to impact or failure. Or bombardment," I muttered. We kept watching. Hobbs' posture stayed more natural than Wolf's. He did not freeze into the same presentation pose, at least not at first. He shifted, grimaced, clawed at his own skin until we strapped his hands down. He muttered in his sleep, strings of disconnected words about heat and pressure and something squeezing his skull. We gave him pain relief until his breathing softened. I told myself we were easing his suffering. Another part of me catalogued the way the analgesics affected the spread rate. When we left the cell between watches, the small knot of crew outside the cordoned corridor stared at us with wide eyes. One of them, an older hand named Carlin, stepped forward. "Is it true," he asked, "that it is using their skin to write?" "Do not repeat rumors," I replied. "But is it true?" I thought of Wolf's frozen torso, Hobbs' ridged chest. "Parts of it," I allowed. "Then what happens to the rest of us?" "That depends on how well we follow containment and how fast we work," I answered. "Go get your filters checked. Clean gear only. No unnecessary movement between modules." He hesitated, then nodded and shuffled away. The station felt smaller with each passing hour. More doors locked, more corridors marked off with bright warnings. The mess hall grew quieter, not because fewer men ate there, but because no one wanted to linger. In my bunk, I dreamed of ridges crawling under my own skin. Awake, I tried not to scratch. The turning point came when Rigg found the secret I had been keeping. We had not told him exactly how much Hobbs' script had advanced. He knew the basics. Second infection, same mechanism, similar spread. He did not know about the difference in content. I did not tell him for one simple, selfish reason. If he saw how rich the text was, how much more complete this second monument might be, he would be more likely to kill it early, to cut his losses. I needed time, and I was willing to steal it. That felt ugly to admit, even in my own head. But there it was. We spent another day inside the isolation cell, swapping imaging rigs, capturing sequences of the script as it grew across Hobbs' hips and thighs. The narrative bands took on new shapes. Toward his lower ribs, the carved figures stood under arching forms that might have been domes. The glyphs around those forms repeated a cluster Spinks had started calling home or city. Higher up, near the diaphragm, the towers from before leaned farther, cracks drawn up their sides. Above them, something enormous loomed. It was hard to interpret, just a dense mass of carved lines, but the impression was of a swollen core surrounded by radiating tendrils. Around it, smaller shapes clustered and then disappeared. "It looks like," Spinks began. "Do not say it," I cut in. "Do not give it a name yet." "A predator," he finished anyway, ignoring me. "Moving between those towers, eating them, or feeding on whatever they built." We recorded that too. Then, midway through one shift, the isolation room door opened and Rigg stepped inside, helmet under his arm, in full biosuit. "You should not be in here," I snapped. "You are in command. If you are exposed—" "I am already exposed," he answered. "We live in the same tin can. I needed to see this for myself." He looked past me at Hobb. The engineer lay on the cot, straps around his wrists and ankles. His chest and arms were a solid field of script now. No bare skin left. His face had become a mask of ridges. Only his eyes remained his own, darting under half-closed lids. Rig took a step closer to the observation screen mounted above the cot. "That is more than we saw on Wolf," he said quietly. "Yes," I answered. "The contagion is using him differently. It is expanding the narrative." "Why did you not tell me?" "Because you would have ordered a purge," I answered, meeting his gaze. "And we need this. Wolf's script ended with their cities in mid-collapse. Hob carries what comes next." "And what does come next?" Rig asked. "That." Spinks pointed at Hob's diaphragm, where the carved image of the looming mass stretched across his ribs. "We think that represents whatever wiped them out." "So we know there was a big thing and it killed them," Rig snapped. "How does that help us?" "We also see how they fought it," I countered. "Look at these segments along the lower torso. The figures there have different markings from the earlier ones. They are thinner, less dense. The towers around them are darker. We think that might represent changes they made, ways they tried to hide." "That is still guesswork." "Yes," I admitted. "But as the script continues, those marks repeat. They form sequences around certain structures. If we can decode the pattern, we can extract instructions." "Instructions," he repeated. "You think this is a manual?" "I think this is a record of failure and an attempt to make sure the next civilization does not repeat it. They did not carve this into stone. They designed something that can infect any compatible biology, rebuild it, and speak in meat. That is not an efficient weapon. That is a desperate message." "Or it is both," Spinks put in quietly. "They had enemies. They made a warning that also punishes arrogance. A being touches the organ slab, and its body is turned into a billboard describing how its creators died. Maybe that is their version of a signpost. Do not touch this. Too late for us, of course." Rig looked between us. "And where do I fit into this little theory?" he asked. "I want time," I answered. "A few more cycles. Let the script finish across his torso. Let us capture the entire narrative. Then if you still want to purge him, we do it. But we will have a complete record to work from. We can try to translate, to extract clear directives. And if, in that time, I find another man with lines on his arms..." Rig's voice dropped. "What then?" "Then you do what you have to," I answered. He moved closer to Hob, close enough to see the fine details of the ridges. "Hob," he murmured. "Can you hear me?" Hob's eyes rolled toward him. For a second, the ridges around his mouth twitched, like he was trying to form words. Only a rasp came out. Rig reached for the rail at the foot of the bed, fingers tightening. "You remember the ice tunnel?" he asked. "When we had to patch the leak by hand? I told you then not to go fast, to go right. You mocked me for that for days." A faint flicker passed through Hob's gaze. Pain? Recognition? It was impossible to be sure. "You keep them alive long enough to tell us how to survive," Rig said to me, without looking back. "Then we burn every last trace of this thing. If the board wants samples, they can come scrape them off Triton glass in 1,000 years." He left the cell. The next hours blurred. We ran translation routines on the images we captured, comparing glyph shapes across different parts of the body. Spinks argued with himself out loud, trying different mappings. These symbols might represent quantities. Those might indicate direction. These clusters might be verbs. We did not find a Rosetta Stone. What we found were repeated groupings around images of the looming mass, of towers, of lines between them. Over time, some of those groupings appeared near figures drawn differently, thinner, hunched, with less detail around their limbs. "Less mass," Spinks muttered. "Maybe that is the point. They changed their own bodies, made themselves smaller, sparser, to avoid drawing attention. Or they starved," I suggested. In the middle of one long stretch of this, a station-wide alert blared. Not the medical chime, the harsh tone reserved for major infrastructure faults. "Control to all stations. came the duty officer's voice. "Bulkhead seal failure between modules F and G. Automatic shutters deployed. Structural integrity compromised." I felt the floor vibrate under my boots. We had had minor leaks before. Hairline cracks in welds, slow seep of atmosphere into surrounding ice. This sounded worse. Riggs' voice cut through the channel seconds later. "Hobbs' maintenance work was interrupted by his collapse," he snapped. "We missed something in that stretch. Stroud, Spinks, stay where you are. I need all non-essential personnel locked until we assess the damage." I went anyway. Not because I thought I could fix a broken bulkhead better than engineers, but because if we had lost a compartment, that meant our world just shrank again, and I wanted to see which corner had gone dark. By the time I reached the junction between F and G, the shutters had already dropped. They were heavy slabs of composite, sliding down from the ceiling and up from the floor, meeting in the middle to seal off a compromised section. Frost feathered along their edges. Carlin stood at the junction, helmet on, suit half-strapped. "They think a support ring shifted," he muttered as I approached. "Cracked the seam. If it went a few centimeters more, we would have had a corridor venting straight into the ice." "Any casualties?" I asked. "No. Hobb had already left this section before he dropped. He probably saved us all a breach by tightening half those bolts before he fell." Great. Another debt we could not repay. I went back to the isolation cell, mind buzzing. Every small failure felt heavier now. The contagion might kill us from within, but Triton and our own hardware still had teeth. I stepped inside, peeled off the outer layer of gear, and moved straight to Hobbs' cot. The script had reached his hips. Above, along his lower ribs, the image of the looming mass had gained detail. It was still mostly abstract. A central core, porous and irregular, surrounded by tendrils that reached toward clusters of stylized towers. Around it, thin lines radiated outward, branching into smaller forks. At the edges of those radiating lines, tiny marks appeared. Little hooks, barely distinguishable from noise, but repeating. "What do those represent?" I asked. Spink squinted, then zoomed in. "Signal trails," he murmured. "Maybe. Or flows. They start at each cluster and lead toward the central mass." "So it follows something they emit," I said. "Heat, radiation. Something tied to high energy usage." "We already know we fit that category," he replied. "We light up space, radio, fusion, drive plumes. If the alien builder species thought they could hide by thinning their cities and altering their own biology, it did not work. The thing still found them. Then maybe the instructions are about how to live after you know you are marked, not how to avoid being marked at all." The thought lodged in my gut. We spent another half cycle tending to Hobb and studying the script, and then everything broke at once. It started with a knock on the isolation cell door. Not the open-close cycle, a literal knock. 3 sharp raps of gloved knuckles. "Rig?" I called. "No," came the muffled answer. "Molesworth." I opened the inner panel. The medic's face appeared through the small window, eyes wide, skin pale. "We have another one," he whispered. "Who?" "Carlin." "How bad?" He lifted his wrist and angled it toward the glass. Along his inner forearm, faint ridges had begun to rise, running in neat rows. "Exposure pathway is unknown," he said. I checked his logs. He has not been near the lab, Wolf or Hobb. He was at the bulkhead seal, that is all. Something in me went quiet. This thing was moving faster and farther than we thought. Everybody in the station was now a potential host, regardless of their contact history. There is a point where containment stops being a practical path and becomes a narrative we tell ourselves to feel in control. I knew we had crossed that line, even if none of us wanted to admit it. "Report in person to Rig," I told Molesworth. "Show him. Tell him exposure pathways are uncontrolled. Then ask him to give me one last window before he calls the carrier." "What are you going to do?" Molesworth asked. "What I should have done already." He stared for a beat, then nodded and moved away. I stood in the cramped chamber between a man being carved into a history book and the door to the rest of the station, and thought about my options. We had one organ slab in a pod, 2.5 infected bodies, counting Carlin's early lines. Limited time before the consortium decided Triton was cheaper as a crater than as a risk. There was one obvious way to get a complete record. Allow the contagion to finish its work on a host with enough surface area, and then carve the script off in as many samples as needed. That approach had costs. We were already paying them. There was another way, one I had been avoiding, because it involved crossing a line I had sworn never to cross again. Self-experimentation is frowned on for good reasons. You cannot be objective about your own suffering. You will push yourself further than you should. You will make decisions for the rest of the world based on what you think your pain is worth. On the other hand, I had more training than anyone else on that rock, and my body was as available as any other. If I became the host, I would at least be making that choice for myself. I went to the organ chamber. The slab section in the pod was not the only piece of the alien organ complex we had. The main body still slumbered in the vault beneath the ice, wired into the walls and ceiling, waiting. The station's main lifts and trams were under restricted access now, but I had clearance codes. I used them. The descent shaft atmosphere read different this time. My suit sensors flagged not the crisp, faintly metallic profile of processed air, but something richer, a trace of old meat left too long, buried under disinfectant. The purge on Wolf had blown frozen tissue dust into the vents. Filters had caught most of it, not all. I tightened my helmet seals on instinct. At the bottom, the tunnel into the cavern looked narrower than before. Our footprints from the first visit had preserved as shallow depressions in the frost. They led straight to the organ slab. In the absence of our portable lamps, the chamber seemed dimmer. I activated my shoulder lamp. The slab glistened in the beam, ridges and pits casting small shadows. I stepped close enough to feel the cold radiating off it through my suit. This is stupid, one part of my mind observed. You are about to infect yourself with a biohazard that you still barely understand. Another part answered. If I do not, someone else will get infected anyway, and we will waste those hours while we pretend we are in control. I moved my gloved hand over the surface, close but not touching. Subtle shifts rippled along the tissue, following the warmth like a plant tracking sunlight. The ridges swelled toward my palm, then subsided when I pulled away. I listened for a long time, to my own breath inside the helmet, to the faint creak of ice above. Then I keyed my helmet comm. "Commander," I said, "it is Stroud. I am in the vault." For a few seconds, nothing. Then his voice snapped into my ear. "What are you doing down there?" "Finishing this." "You step back from that slab right now," he barked. "That is an order." "I cannot. We have 3 infections already that we know about. Probably more brewing. You know as well as I do that this has outrun containment. The carrier will call you any minute now and ask for a status update. So here it is. We either send them a full warning carved in someone's skin, or we send them a crater. "I will not lose you too," he snapped. The rawness in his tone startled me more than the words. "Crispin, do not do this alone. At least allow me to." "This is exactly why I have to," I cut in. "I am the one who made the call to keep Wolf alive for study. I am the one who let the autopsy aerosolize. I am the one who convinced you to keep Hob breathing. My choices brought us here. If there is a cost to finishing the warning, I pay it." He spoke again. "You think martyrdom will balance Mars." "This has nothing to do with Mars," I lied. We both knew it did. I raised my arm and unlocked one wrist seal. Cold rushed in and kissed my damp skin. Goose flesh rose in a wave. "Crispin," Rig whispered. "Do not." "You remember what you told me when you dragged me out of that review hearing?" I asked. "You said, if you are going to ruin your life for a principle, at least pick one worth the wreckage." "I was drunk," he muttered. "And you were right." I pressed my bare forearm against the slab. The tissue felt softer than it looked, like meat left in a cold room too long. Under the surface, something stirred. A wave of pressure met my skin, then 1,000 tiny points pushed inward. It did not feel like a cut. It felt like an invasion. Fine needles sliding between cells, moving along the grain of my flesh. A warmth rose under the cold, followed by a bright, sharp pain that flared and then settled into a throbbing ache. I forced myself to hold contact for a slow count, then pulled my arm away. My skin looked unchanged for a moment. Then a faint discoloration bloomed along the contact area, like a bruise in fast motion. Lines emerged within it. Straight, narrow ridges, lighter than the surrounding skin. I keyed my comm. Exposure confirmed, returning topside. You are coming straight to isolation, Rig bit off. You do not stop anywhere else. You do not talk to anyone else. If you set one foot toward any other module, I will lock the shaft and leave you down there. Understood, I answered. The ride back up blurred. I kept my arm close, watching the ridges rise and lengthen. The pain intensified, a deep burn under the surface, as if someone poured boiling water into my veins. At the top, the shaft door opened onto a row of armed men in suits. Rig stood in front, helmet on, visor down, pistol slung at his side in a way that did not feel symbolic. You always did like grand gestures, he muttered as I stepped out. Grand gestures are for people who do not expect to live long enough to deal with the aftermath, I replied. Right now, I am betting on living long enough to finish one job. He looked at my arm. The ridges there had already crossed my wrist and were heading toward my elbow. I should put a bullet in your skull right now, he said quietly. That would be the clean choice. It would also erase your chance at a usable warning, I answered. You are not a clean choice kind of man, Brogan. Not when the stakes are this high. He signaled his men to stand down. You go to the comms room, he said. Not the isolation cells. I want you near the transmitters, not buried in a side module. Spinks and Molesworth will join you. No one else. We lock that room, and if anyone tries to open the door without my authorization, they die on the threshold. Rig stepped close enough that his helmet brushed mine. You do not leave that room. You do not touch anyone. You do not indulge any pain that tells you to do something clever. You read the script, and when you are done, you give me a clear yes or no on whether we burn this rock. I will do my best, I replied. His eyes were very dark behind the face shield. You do not get to fail this one, he said. The comms room became my world. It sat at the center of the station, near the main mast, with one wall dominated by the high-gain transmitter controls and a big, old-fashioned viewport looking out through a layered glass slit at the ice beyond. We stripped most of the chairs and extra consoles and set up a medical bed in the middle. Spinks installed recording rigs around it. Molesworth wheeled in an equipment cart with monitoring gear and a small set of restraints. In case the posture reflex starts, I muttered, eyeing the straps. In case you try to walk, he answered. I will not wrestle you, Doc. I will strap you down and call it good. Fair enough. The pain in my arm had spread to my shoulder by then. The ridges followed, knitting themselves across my skin in neat rows. My fingers tingled. It moves faster in you, Spinks noted, watching his pad. Maybe because you gave it direct access, not just a smear. Or because it has learned, I replied. Second and third infections often progress faster, less lag while the invader adapts. I lay down on the bed. The metal frame creaked under my weight. Molesworth tightened straps across my forearms and ankles, not enough to hurt, just enough to limit sudden movements. You sure you want the restraints this early? He asked. I do not trust myself not to scratch when it starts itching in places I cannot reach. Just leave my right hand free enough to hold a mic or a stylus. He adjusted the strap accordingly. The first hours were manageable. The ridges moved up my arm, across my shoulder, and onto my chest. They tracked along my collarbone, down over my ribs. They felt like cords being threaded under the skin, tugging from inside. At first, they were faint, like shallow scars. Then they thickened. My skin puckered around them. Each new row brought a fresh wave of pain, sharp at first, then dull, settling into a constant background roar. We recorded everything. Spinks perched on a stool beside the bed, stylus flying over his pad, eyes darting between my skin and the reference images from Wolf and Hob. The initial bands match the prologue on Wolf's torso, he observed. Same clusters, same spacing. The differences start near your sternum. See here. He pointed. The ridges there had formed a series of hooked shapes I recognized from Hob's chest. That is their extinction, I murmured. We are starting later. Yes. The contagion appears to be using you as an overlay, filling in missing sections rather than repeating the whole record. So it knows what it already wrote on the others, I said. Great. Over the next stretch, the script marched across my chest, my abdomen, my sides. When it reached my back, I felt the pressure along my spine, muscles tightening involuntarily. At one point, Molesworth noticed my breathing had gone shallow and upped the pain control through an intravenous line he had slipped into my uninfected hand. You go too far past the line. You will start hallucinating, he warned. We need you lucid enough to read. I will tell you if I start seeing things that are not there, I replied. That is the problem. How are we supposed to tell the difference? We found a rhythm. Ridges rose. Spinks called out glyph descriptions. I confirmed where I could, based on earlier records. When new clusters appeared, we marked them as such. At intervals, through the door intercom, Rig checked in. How long until you have something I can send? He asked once. Depends how long it takes the script to cover the operational instruction sections, Spinks answered. Right now we are still in the part where their world dies. Skip ahead, Rig snapped. I do not care how they suffered. I care what we can do to avoid joining them. It does not work like that. Language is narrative. Meaning is in the order. If we do not understand the lead-up, we may misread the instructions. I heard the faint scrape of his hand against the door panel. You have less time than you think, he said quietly. The carrier just called. They detect irregular radiation spikes from Triton. They want to know if we are playing with anything that could leak. Radiation? Spinks frowned. Where? Mostly from the main mast and the heat exchangers, Rig replied. I told them it is routine station fluctuation. They did not fully buy it. I stared at the ceiling. Radiation spikes from the mast and exchangers, areas where we concentrated power. The looming mass in the script did not move toward random points. It went for clusters of tall shapes with lines radiating from them. It hunts energy, I murmured. They are showing us that the more you burn, the brighter you shine. We are a lighthouse. What was that? Rig asked. Nothing you can fix in an hour, I answered. The script kept coming. When it reached my neck, breathing became harder. The ridges wrapped around the muscles there, tightening like a collar. I forced each inhale, each exhale, measured and slow. Let me know if your voice fails, Spinks said. We will need to switch to visual recording only. Pain took over more of my perception. The world narrowed to small slices. The pressure on this part of my chest, then that one. The itch crawling up my scalp, the weight at my ankles where the straps held. Through it all, I listened. The script was not a language I could read in any normal sense, but as we cross-referenced the glyphs with the images they had carved on Wolf and Hob, a structure emerged. Certain glyph clusters appeared consistently near depictions of the looming mass. Others clustered around towers or around altered figures with thinned limbs and sparse surroundings. When those clusters appeared together, the surrounding bands often showed fewer radiating lines. Here, I said at one point, when a sequence wrapped around my left side. This group links the predator symbol with the thinned figures and a set of domes. That might be the instruction series. What does it tell us? Rig asked over the intercom. Reduce your density. Spinks answered. Thin your populations, lower your emissions, keep your nervous systems cold and dim, use underground structures and minimal radiative output. In short, stop acting like a beacon in the dark. And if we do not, then the thing that ate them will see us, I whispered, if it has not already. Silence fell over the channel for a few heartbeats. Can we stop what we are already doing? Rig asked. We have transmitters, reactors, drive flares. The board is throwing energy around the system like confetti. Even if we go dark, we have left our fingerprints everywhere. In the short term, we can reduce our signature, I answered. Shut down non-essential systems, go into low-power mode, hide in the shadows. Long term? I shrugged, or tried to. The straps and the ridges made it hard. We would have to convince humanity to change how it lives, to be quiet, to accept that being seen is a risk. Humanity does not do quiet, Rig muttered. Then we at least tell them what is out there, I replied. Let them decide knowing the cost. Do we know what is out there? He asked. I closed my eyes for a second. The looming mass carved on my ribs seemed to shift with my breath. We know enough to call it hungry. Another system alert cut through our conversation, low, insistent tone repeating. What now? Spinks groaned. Rig's voice came back sharp. Cold purge in Module D just tripped on its own. No one in there. Sensors read fluctuating pressure. I am cutting circulation to that entire arm. This place is coming apart. The ridges had reached my scalp. I felt them cross my skull like hands pressing from the inside, pushing bone plates slightly apart to make room. How long do we have? I asked. Until something critical fails, Rig replied. Less than a day, more than an hour. Enough time to finish if you stop talking and start dictating. He was right. We set aside speculation and focused on transcription. The contagion worked with brutal efficiency. By mid-cycle, it had covered nearly every part of my visible skin. My arms and legs were solid bands of script. My torso was a mural. Only small patches remained bare, around my eyes and along the soles of my feet. Every new line hurt. Some fell into a dull background ache, others spiked bright and sharp. Through it all, I forced my voice to keep running. This cluster here, I rasped as Spinks's stylus moved, repeats near depictions of subterranean chambers. The glyph at the start may indicate initiation. The following group, near those domes, could be a location marker. Around the predator icon, the same cluster is crossed out in several places. Maybe they are showing failed hiding places. Then where do they not cross it out? Spinks asked. Here, I muttered. Near the end, on Wolf's shoulder. And now, on my right thigh. See? The cluster appears without the cross mark, near a small group of figures in a narrow chamber with minimal radiating lines. He zoomed in on the recorded image. So they found some way to become less visible, but only after losing most of themselves. Or after sending this warning, I suggested. The conclusion became clearer as we mapped more sequences. The contagion carried 3 kinds of information. The story of their end, instructions for hiding, and the method for transmitting those instructions through any biology that touched their organ complexes. We now had a rough grasp of all 3. We knew how they died. We had a sense of how they tried to hide, even if we could not replicate their exact techniques on human timescales. We understood that the contagion turned hosts into monuments to carry their message forward. What we did not yet have was a compact way to send all that home. Summarize, Rig demanded. We do not have bandwidth for a 12-hour stream of raw glyph footage. The carrier can relay a single tight burst back to the inner planets before they cut us off. We picked the critical clusters, Spinks answered. The ones around the predator icon, the ones near the successful hiding depiction, and the basic mapping of the glyph set. With that, any linguist or exobiologist with our notes can rebuild the rest from raw footage. And we tell them in plain language what those clusters mean, I added. Even if our interpretation is partially wrong, it will be better than silence. Then do it, Rig replied. We composed the message under pressure. Spinks and I, with Molesworth occasionally interjecting a practical note, selected the most important script segments. We recorded close shots of them on my skin, mapping each glyph to a simple symbol we could encode in a standard text stream. Then, we drafted a header. "This is Dr. Crispin Stroud of Triton Survey Facility," I dictated. "We have discovered a biological record left by an extinct alien civilization. The record is encoded in a contagious tissue that rewrites host bodies into written monuments depicting their extinction and the nature of the threat that destroyed them." I paused to cough. The ridges had begun to creep along my tongue. Speaking hurt. "The threat," I continued, "is a spacefaring predator that locates advanced civilizations by their energy emissions. It feeds on dense nervous tissue and high-energy infrastructure. The aliens attempted to hide by reducing their population density, lowering their emissions, and moving underground. They failed, but their instructions offer guidance on how to make that failure slower and survival more likely for anyone who comes after." We kept it brief. No dramatics, no appeals, just facts, as clear as we could make them. By the time we finished, my voice had gone harsh and thin. The pain control helped less. My skin felt tight everywhere, stretched over unfamiliar shapes. Rig opened the door long enough to step inside. He had stripped his suit down to the underlayer, face bare. Stubble shadowed his jaw. His eyes looked older. "You have what you need?" he asked. "Yes," Spinks answered. "We have the critical sequences. We have the mapping. We have the header." "Then we are done," Rig said. Systems groaned as he diverted power from non-essential modules. Lights dimmed around us. Somewhere in the bowels of the station, pumps slowed. "Carrier is moving to safe distance," he reported. "They will be out of tight beam range soon. We have one shot at this." Molesworth tightened my restraints, more out of habit than necessity now. I did not think I had the strength to stand, let alone walk. Rig cued the message, attached the compressed glyph packet, and looked over at me. "You ready?" he asked. "As I will ever be." He hit transmit. Somewhere above us, the mast glowed unseen, sending our warning out along a narrow band toward the inner system. I pictured it in my mind's eye, a slender thread of signal stretching through space, carrying a dead species' last lesson, rewritten in human flesh. "There," Rig murmured. "It is done." His shoulders sagged. He looked tired in a way I had never seen. "What now?" Molesworth asked quietly. "Now," Rig answered, "we make sure this thing does not leave Triton." He moved to the reactor console. Triton's survey facility's self-destruct was not a dramatic countdown with fancy lights. It was a manual sequence, designed to dump the reactor's full output into the surrounding ice in a single sustained surge, turning our underground nest into a pocket of steam and boiling slush. "The carrier is clear?" I croaked. "They are pulling back and transmitting our burst to the board," Rig replied. "They wanted to lower a shuttle and pick us up. I refused." Spinks stared at him. "You refused escape. If even a trace of this contagion made it onto their deck, everything we did here would be pointless. I am not risking that. They will hate me for it. They can file a complaint on my grave." He keyed in the destruct sequence. Each step required a physical confirmation. Flip a cover, turn a key, press a recessed button. Old design, intended to prevent accidents. No one wanted a bored technician leaning on the wrong switch and turning a research station into a crater. As he worked, he came to my bedside. "You understand why I am staying?" "Yes." He gripped the bed rail. "When I pulled you out of Mars, I told myself I was doing it to give you a chance to redeem yourself. That was ego. The truth is, I needed someone who would walk into rooms like this without flinching. You did every time, even when you should have walked away." He looked at my skin, at the script covering me. "I am sorry I asked that of you," he murmured. "You did not ask. I walked in on my own. That is worse." He reached down and touched my uninfected hand. His palm felt warm, calloused. For a moment, we were just two men in a room, not a commander and his contaminated exopathologist at the end of the world. "Vernon," he called without looking away from me. "Spinks, you two can still get out." "No," Molesworth answered. "I check myself. I see early ridges. I am not bringing this into anyone else's air." "I am not leaving my work unfinished," Spinks added. "There is still more to extract from these records. If the board sends a team later, I want them to find my notes in whatever twisted museum this place becomes." "Then we are all damned fools," Rig muttered. He returned to the console and finished the sequence. The station shuddered as systems shifted to destruct prep. The lights brightened for a moment, then settled into a dim, uniform glow as power rerouted. "We have a short delay before full vent," Rig reported. "Gives us time to finish any last notes, or prayers, if you are into that sort of thing." "I have one request," I whispered. He turned. "Name it." "Seal me in the observation chamber. The one with the viewport. It faces Neptune." He frowned. "You will die alone." "I am dying anyway. I would rather do it somewhere I can see something bigger than these walls." Spinks winced. Molesworth looked away. Rig hesitated, then nodded. "All right, you earned that much." He and Molesworth unbuckled the restraints and moved me as gently as they could manage. My muscles did not respond well. The ridges along my joints had stiffened, every shift burned. They half carried, half dragged me down the corridor to the observation chamber. It was a small room with a single chair bolted to the floor and a wide, thick window looking out through the ice at the blackness beyond. Normally, we used it for radiation sky surveys and the occasional moment of crew respite. Neptune filled most of the view now, a massive disk of swirling blue and white, markings sliding slowly as the planet turned. Rig lowered me into the chair. My skin felt tight everywhere, script pulling it taut. Even my fingers were engraved, every knuckle banded. Only the back of my right hand had a small patch of bare skin left, near the thumb. He strapped me in, more to keep me from sliding to the floor than anything. "You can still call us through the intercom," he said, nodding at the panel near my hand. "Until the surge hits, at least." "I know." He lingered a moment, one hand on my shoulder, careful not to touch any of the ridges. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For picking a principle worth the wreckage." He stepped out. The door slid shut. Alone, I looked at my arm. The script there was dense and dark. The glyphs close to my wrist matched the beginning of the record. Higher up, along the forearm and biceps, the clusters shifted. Near the elbow, a familiar sequence wrapped around the curve. The hiding instructions, the same ones we had found on Wolf's shoulder and my thigh. I lifted my hand slowly, joints stiff, and traced one of the lines with a fingertip. The raised ridge felt warm under my touch, like a scar just starting to heal. Behind the glass, Neptune hung huge and distant, its cloud bands crawling at a pace that made human panic feel very small. Pain ebbed and surged. My thoughts wandered. On Mars, I had stood behind glass and watched people die because I waited for permission to act. On Triton, I had cut the glass myself and stepped through, because there was no one left to grant permission. Both choices killed people. Both choices saved them. There are no clean hands in outbreak work. There are only hands that keep moving. Somewhere in the station, deep under my feet, the reactor began to overrun its limits. The floor trembled. A distant roar built, more felt than heard. I rested my hand on my arm and followed one line of script from my wrist to my elbow, like a child tracing a sentence he cannot yet read but knows is important. "Listen," I whispered. Not sure if I spoke to the dead aliens, to whoever received our message, or to whatever might be gliding through the dark between stars, sniffing for heat. The glass before me brightened as currents shifted in Neptune's atmosphere. My vision darkened at the edges. Pain thinned into something far away. As the station shook itself apart around me, as the ice began to melt and refreeze and melt again, I sat strapped in that chair, tracing the ridges on my own skin, my body a monument to someone else's last words and my own. The reactor's surge reached the surrounding ice, and light flared across the window. For a second, Neptune looked like it was seen through water. I kept my finger on that one line of script until I could not feel anything at all.